So good, my name is Kayleigh Howald. I'm the archivist of the Delray Beach Historical Society. Before we get started tonight, first of all, I just want to say thank you to everybody for coming tonight. And just, for being here and allowing me to share this history. This has been professionally the best 2 years of my life. Definitely professionally, right? But it's been great, and I owe a lot of that to the fantastic team that I work with, and the fantastic community that I get to be a part of. So, and that's all of you guys here, so I appreciate it, so thank you. Yeah, give yourselves a round of applause. Right? All right. Let's actually turn this on so I can do my job. Okay, there we go. So since it is Black History Month, and we are a historical society, I want us to think for a moment about history, what it means to study it, to talk about it, and ultimately to learn from it. And I think a lot of people tend to approach history as just the study of what a person did and when they did it, without looking at the how or the why. But what they may not realize is that that takes all the fun out of it. Right? For those of us who appreciate history, we see it not just as facts and dates, but as the totality of human stories, emotions, decisions, and discoveries. And history is fundamentally about the choices that people made in the past. And it's an investigation into the conditions or the context of those choices and how those choices expanded or contracted the paths available to them or other people. So when we look at the history of the modern civil rights movement, this complex period of time in American history between roughly 1941 and 1965, we're not only looking at the choices of people who challenged the status quo, who reclaimed public space, who resisted and who persisted, but we're also looking at the choices of people who had power or privilege and wanted to keep it, and why. And so tonight we'll explore the history of the civil rights movement in Delray Beach, how it came to be, what became important, and the choices that were made along the way. Now, of course, every good historian knows that empathy should always come before judgment in history. But I'm an archivist, so not quite a historian, right? So if you do detect a hint of judgment, just know that I'm still working on becoming a better historian. So it's important to remember that, important to note that from its inception, Delray had an engaged, politically active Black community. The first school and church in Delray were built by Black Bahamians and African Americans from the Panhandle in southeastern United States in the 1890s. And in the city's first election in 1911, nearly 20% of the voters were Black. And this included names, or at the very least surnames, that you may recognize. Albert Cohen, Cornell Bright, Ed Chambers, William Robinson, and Arthur Youngblood. And in that election, businessman George Green received 16 votes for alderman. And so, if you can do that quick math, right, of 57 people and 20%, so it's about 11 Black voters in Delray at that time, and he received 16, right? So he was getting kind of wider support for alderman, and only really missed it by about 14 votes. But still, Delray was under Jim Crow laws, or state and local laws that enforced racial segregation. And so public spaces, like railway stations, pictured here, this is Delray's FEC station in approximately 1915. It might be a little bit hard to see, but above the doorway, it says white, because that was the white entrance. And so these public spaces were segregated, as were businesses and neighborhoods. And while some Jim Crow segregation was de facto, or by practice or by fact, in the 1930s, the city moved to make strict segregation legal. And like so many things in Delray, it started with the beach. So in January 1935, the city council ordered new rules for the beaches. In the report in the Delray Beach News read, quote, "Colored maids will not be allowed on the beach except when attending white children." Then in June 1935, the city adopted Resolution 146, which designated a, quote, Negro area and white area within city limits. It created boundaries for Black-owned homes and businesses, established limitations for building permits, and limited who could occupy buildings based on race, with an exception for servants' quarters within the white settlement. In 1938, the city formalized these districts and wrote Jim Crow more permanently into the city's laws. Ordinance 209, which will later be referred to as Ordinance 17-34, it designated the settlement districts as police districts, and that made this earlier resolution enforceable or more enforceable. It also blocked permits for Black residents and business owners outside of police lines and clearly defined curfews. And this officially made Delray Beach a sundown town. And so that meant that starting in 1937, when the curfews were originally put into place, an alarm would sound across the city at 9 p.m. to signify the start of the curfew at 10 p.m. Now, as I've continued to research this, so as Winnie said, right, we were working on our exhibit about a year ago, and part of that was kind of digging more into the history and to sort of how we got to that point, right, and getting into that context. And I've continued to research this resolution and ordinance, and you will hear about it later, I promise. But as I've continued to research it, one question kept coming back to me: why the 1930s? Right? Delray in the 1920s, again, was growing like most places in Florida. And with the arrival of Solomon D. Spady in the 1920s, economic and educational opportunities were growing. And so something changes in the 1930s. And usually when we see this legislation happening back to back or consecutively, it follows a very specific event or a series of events, but that's not quite the case here. So why start legislating so harshly now? And when I found an answer in the newspapers and in the records, I wasn't very satisfied with it. So in early 1937, the Delray Beach News reported that new curfews went into effect specifically for Black residents, quote, as an emergency measure by the police department following a series of housebreakings and a purse snatching episode a few days later. Now, does it surprise me that a citywide discrimination law was reportedly caused by nonviolent crimes? No, this is Florida in the 1930s. Doesn't surprise me at all. But this didn't just impact the Black community, it didn't just hurt the Black community, right? White businesses lost customers and lost money and even petitioned the city government to extend the curfew because of the impact to their business. So again, why was this happening, particularly in 1935? Well, while west of Swinton, right, looked like this in the 1930s, east of Swinton looked like this in the 1930s. So it's important to remember that in the 1930s, Delray Beach became a haven for writers, artists, and many wealthy seasonal residents. New homes and buildings were being erected throughout Delray, starting with a big surge in 1935. So the local economy depended heavily on tourism and sort of restarting its economy with that tourism. And so there's a very specific image being projected in public spaces for the purpose of tourists. And it's not one of equity or diversity, right? Instead, it's one of whiteness and of exclusivity. And so this is the world throughout the 1940s and during the 1940s. But during and especially after World War II, there's a notable shift in the nation, and it permeates its way to Florida. Want to go? Okay, there. So during World War II, Black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier promoted the Double V campaign, which is victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. And the goals were equity in the armed forces, fair employment practices in the defense industries, and a broader civil rights legislation. And many soldiers, like Delray native Ozzie Youngblood, pictured right up there at the top, returned from World War II with a renewed sense of pride, energy, and focus on obtaining the equality they fought so hard for overseas. And as the United States entered its post-war years, there was an optimism for the future for all Americans. And beginning with the first freedom rides in 1947 and the desegregation of the armed forces in 1948, millions of ordinary people recognized the need to end legal segregation. Through nonviolent demonstrations, boycotts, and lawsuits, organizations like the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equity, or CORE, the Student Nonviolent Action Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference challenged segregation in schools, public facilities, and public transportation. And in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that separate but equal laws were unconstitutional in Brown versus Board of Education, and they ordered states to integrate with all deliberate speed. And the courts made similar decisions on public parks, playgrounds, beaches, and public transportation in 1955 and 1956. And it's partly why we see these years becoming so important in Delray. Right? And yet the court, in their ruling, had this very deliberate language, and that allowed states and cities, especially in the South, to delay desegregation, and Florida was no exception. But in 1956, two students from Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, or FAMU, Wilhelmina Jakes and Carrie Patterson, sat in a whites-only section of a Tallahassee bus. And when Jakes and Patterson were arrested, FAMU students organized a campus-wide boycott of the city buses. And civil rights leaders organized carpools and front ride demonstrations, which are pictured here. And so despite threats and complicated segregation laws that the city tried to put into effect, Tallahassee buses were officially integrated in 1957. And similar victories occurred in Miami and other cities in Florida, proving that integration was possible, right, in the Sunshine State. And so there was some hope in Delray Beach. And in the 1950s, and if you've been over to our exhibit, you're like, this is the live audiobook version of this exhibit, what's happening here, right? And you're very familiar with this notion, right? In the 1950s, Delray Beach was booming. In 1950, the population of Delray Beach was 6,312. By 1960, it nearly doubled to 12,230, and it continued to grow from there. By the end of the 1970s, Delray's population reached over 30,000. So it's a big jump in a relatively short period of time. Right? And by 1959, almost half of Delray's developed land was residential. And so we see a meteoric rise in retail businesses and restaurants, car dealerships, and even movie theaters. And we also see a rise in hotels and apartments and motor lodges, mostly kind of catering to tourists. Because by 1956, Delray was dependent on tourism for 75% of its revenue. And while Delray Beach's public access to the beach and the ocean was a notable selling point, Black tourists and residents were strongly discouraged from using the city's public facilities, including, or outside of their district, and that included both the beach and the municipal pool. Where they were not discouraged, they were denied access and then turned away. And so Black residents had to fight their way through trees and scrubs to an unguarded beachfront, usually south of Delray Beach, and that faced growing development. So the beachfront that was available to people continued to shrink. And without access to a public swimming pool, many people never learned how to swim. And calls for beach frontage and a pool began as early as 1944. In December 1953, the city purchased a 100-foot stretch of beach, or 100-foot stretch of sand in Ocean Ridge and declared it the, quote, colored beach. Lights and portable toilets were added, but the coastline, for the most part, remains inhospitable because of how rocky it was. And in addition to the treacherous rocks, the beach did not have a lifeguard. And so white residents, as well in Ocean Ridge and Briny Breezes, actually protested the presence of Black swimmers. And at that time, there were no plans to build a public pool in the Black community. Then, in 1955, the Delray Beach Civic League, a local civil rights group, submitted a petition to the City Commission. And according to the petition, Delray Beach's Black residents, quote, solely because of their race and ancestry have been denied the use of said beach and other public facilities set apart for public recreation. And this refusal violated the equal protection of laws guaranteed by both the federal and state constitutions. And in a special meeting, Commissioner and former Mayor Catherine Strong said that she supported creating additional public beaches in southern Palm Beach County. But the commission said it was, quote, not the duty of the commission to answer the petition. So on March 1st, 1955, Tampa-based attorney Francisco A. Rodriguez Jr., special counsel for the NAACP, and the son of an Afro-Cuban labor leader and cigar maker, filed a federal lawsuit against Mayor W.J. Snow and the Delray Beach City Commission on behalf of 9 Delray Beach residents to open the public beach and pool for, quote, use on an equal basis with whites. And the plaintiffs, some of them pictured here, were Leroy Bain, Joseph Baldwin, Clinton Freeman, William Hardwick, George McKay, Lee Monroe, Elmore Watkins, Lee L. Youngblood, and O.Z. Youngblood. And while the lawsuit was pending, many continued on the way they had before. They continued to travel to a, again, undeveloped patch of coastline just south of Delray Beach near Boca Raton. And that section of beach would mark a pivotal moment and a pivotal turning point in the fight for an open beach and the beginning of what would become a very tumultuous summer in Delray Beach. On May 13th, 1956, 15-year-old James Bay McBride, his younger brother JC, pictured here, and several friends played in the ocean after church. There were no homes, no hotels, and no lifeguards. And while in the waves, JC was caught in a rip current and pulled out to sea. And James sprung into action very quickly to save his brother, pushing him out of the current. But when he did, James was caught in the undertow, and he drowned. It was Mother's Day. And James McBride's death was tragic on its own. Right? Here is a young black boy who is forced to go to an unguarded beach because of the color of his skin, even though there is a perfectly good, right, guarded and accessible beach. Right? And so that was tragic on its own, but what transpired in the days and the weeks immediately following his death, I think added a significant historical weight to it. Because on May 16th, during a hearing for the federal lawsuit against the city, Commissioner Catherine Strong testified that there were no city ordinances banning people of color from the municipal beach and pool. The Miami Herald reported that she said, "The public beaches have always been open to all people regardless of color." And so as a result, federal judge Emmett C. Choate dismissed the case. And for many, this signified a victory. This was an expressed official policy that the municipal beach was open to everyone. Right? There was no law banning anybody. Right? And so city officials, however, would later call this lack of legal segregation adverse publicity. But people started going to the beach and enjoying Delray's best asset without incident for several days. That was until, let's face it, white people ruined it. So a group of 35 to 75 black swimmers from Delray Beach and other parts of South Florida waded into the surf as anywhere between 70 to 100 white onlookers gathered to watch. And as you can tell from those numbers and these pictures, newspaper accounts of the crowd varied dramatically. And soon arguments ensued between the groups of young white and black bathers before police dispersed the crowd and closed the beach. And though no arrests were made, the fear of violence escalated. In addition to threats against city commissioners and members of the Civic League, a group of young white men burned a cross in front of the Ace High Club located on West Atlantic Avenue. And so on May 23rd, 1 week after the federal case was dismissed for not having a law banning anyone from the beach, the City Commission issued an ordinance that formally barred African Americans from both the beach and the swimming pool. The law was adopted without public comment, and Catherine Strong was the only dissenting vote. Commissioners stated that it was passed to prevent interracial riots and curb racial tensions, and if anything, it had the opposite effect. On May 25th, so 2 days later, this timeline is very, very quick. Right? May 25th, the city passed emergency ordinance number 236, which allowed the police department to stop and search, quote, any suspicious vehicles for weapons and set up roadblocks on the bridges and along the beach. And newspapers said the peaceful town looked more like, quote, an armed encampment than one of the society centers of the Florida Gold Coast. And on that first day, the police confiscated 30 weapons, including machetes, knives, a bailing hook, a hunting rifle, and a pistol. However, the important thing to remember here is that Delray, and especially in the 1950s, was a small, rural town, right? So things like machetes and hunting rifles wouldn't have been uncommon to be in the back of someone's car if they needed to shoot a small game animal, right? Or hack through saw palmetto. Right? So these were, items that people did kind of typically have in their car, right? Or just somewhere in the back. But despite the new laws and the steep penalty of a $500 fine and up to 90 days in jail, young Black Floridians continued to protest, and the wait-ins continued each week. And the Civic League wrote a letter to the City Commission proposing alternatives to integrating the beach and the pool. So that included a minimum of 500 feet of oceanfront or beachfront located anywhere between Delray Beach and Boca Raton, and the immediate construction of a swimming pool. And they encouraged peace and harmony in churches and schools, and they patiently waited the 30 days that they could refile the suit in federal court. And this is specifically, they wanted to file it in federal court because, as Leroy Bain noted in an interview with Jet Magazine, we don't mess with the state courts where you can't get any justice. Okay. And what's really interesting about this moment, went too far, there we go. What's really interesting about this moment is kind of the approach that the Civic League has versus kind of what the establishment is doing, right? So the Civic League is approaching this issue of beach segregation and just really approaching this moment in time with very deliberate action and very strategic action, right? So every move they make, everything that they're doing, it's very deliberate and very strategic versus the establishment that's kind of panic legislating. Right? They're just almost kind of just trying to do whatever they possibly can, right? To kind of just make it go away, make it stop, right? But they're just sort of panicking. And Leroy Bain also said in that same interview that, that there was some infighting, right, among a lot of, white legislators and white commissioners, right? And so there's this infighting, and so they're kind of just, I'm gonna let you do it, right? We're gonna wait, and then we're gonna refile again in federal court, because the case was only dismissed because there was no law, and now you put a law in the books. And these protests drew the attention of civil rights leaders all across Florida, so including FAMU football coach Alonzo Smith, Jake Gaither, who traveled to Delray Beach to speak with city commissioners and members of the Civic League. And after the meeting, the city proposed to purchase or lease the beachfront property that was requested, and they approved funds for a pool. And that sounds really promising, right? But we still got a little bit of time left in here. Because a few weeks later, Delray Beach learned that its leaders had other plans. Yep. On June 5th, 1956, the City Commission voted to exclude, quote, the entire Negro area from the city limits. And that is the area that's shaded here. Mayor Michael Yargates announced that it was the only way to keep the tourists coming to Delray Beach. Because God forbid a tourist from New Jersey sees like a Black person enjoying their life, right? Like, God forbid that's happening, right? See, there's that archival judgment. I gotta stop that. But so much like what we see in the 1930s, we see this need to control image and control public spaces for economic development being at the core of leadership decisions, not so much what's just or fair or even logistically sound. But other commissioners admitted privately that it was, in fact, a show of political power. In her letter to Governor Leroy Collins, Catherine Strong wrote, "I cast the lone no vote on this measure because it was a hasty, ill-considered action. My fellow commissioners admitted that they were only doing it to show the Negroes, quote, who's boss." And she also argued that there was no consideration for the logistical nightmare that this would cause with utilities like water, garbage collection, with having an entire kind of this massive area right in the middle of city limits, being outside of it, right? And one could also argue that this was a way to suppress voting, right? So the other thing that this would impact is taxes. And it was fairly common in Delray at that time to have special municipal elections where only taxpayers could vote. And Ozzie Youngblood kind of hinted to this a little bit, again in Jet Magazine, and he said, quote, "What they resent is our power at the polls. we can control an election by sending 500 when the whites send 600. If a candidate wants to get elected, he has to come down here and look us in the eye, and they don't like that. He was also described in that article as fiery and 50-ish, which I think is, and as soon if you've ever read, we do have it available over at the Historical Society for free, his autobiography, A Man of the 20th Century, reading that, he is fiery, right? And Strong reportedly argued during this time, right, she was very outspoken, but she reportedly argued that unincorporating was immoral, unchristian, and undemocratic. She also allegedly said of her fellow commissioners, one has bleeding ulcers, another a bad heart, the third a spot on his lung, and the fourth had a serious gallbladder operation. I'd be careful if I were you, she allegedly told them. You might be called by God before you know it. Right. And following her vote against the exclusionary ordinance, Catherine Strong was snubbed socially. She was insulted, threatened, and she had a cross burnt under her bedroom window. And now I would be both a bad archivist and a bad historian if I did not mention that Commissioner Strong denied these reports. Those incidents were reported by Jet Magazine, and Strong vehemently denied that she said anything against the other commissioners and that all of that was false, all of the reporting was false. However, what Catherine Strong did not count on when she said that is that some nerd would start digging in newspaper articles and find some other information, right? Because in November 1956, the Miami Herald reported that, quote, Catherine Strong, the Delray Beach City Commissioner who was banned from some civic organizations for her racial stand, has been invited to rejoin 2 of them. So if all of that was false, all of that reporting in Jet Magazine was false, not all of it, right? And so that tells us that, again, some of that is being reported of what was reported is true. And the question, of course, in my mind is, who has more to lose here with that information? Certainly not Jet Magazine. All right. It's just food for thought. I still love you, Catherine, it's okay. But the exclusion bill was immediately sent to Tallahassee. But it needed Governor Collins' approval before it could be enacted. And City Attorney John Adams was appointed by the city to lobby for it in the Capitol. And both the Delray Beach Civic League and Commissioner Strong wrote letters to Governor Collins urging him to veto the bill. And the Civic League reminded Collins that this moment in Delray Beach impacted all of Florida, right? So they knew firsthand how important image and tourism was to the Florida economy, especially in the 1950s. But this time it would not be at the expense of their rights. And so the letter read in part, cognizant of the fact that Florida is presently in the infant stage of what promises to be one of the most impressive development programs in the history of the state, the Delray Beach Civic League has done everything humanly possible to effect a solution to this problem. And the commission waited for, and the community waited for Tallahassee's response. Okay. And in the meantime, the city commission predictably voted to cancel its plans for the public pool and put the funds into a city trust fund. And so according to Strong, and this is her letter here, quote, I was told later that the city promised to procure 500 feet of beach and would start construction immediately on a separate swimming pool. Now, however, my fellow commissioners have told me privately that they had no intention of building the pool. Mr. Barrow states that we are not going to give it to them if we can help it. And I want to just note something in that, just somewhat quickly, right? Again, when we talk about history and we think about choices, right? When we read through this and we kind of look at this moment, I don't know if this is 100% about cruelty. I think there is a percentage that is about it. But these decisions, again, are being made to maintain power and maintain privilege and to uphold a white hegemonic system, both social and economic. So that's part of this decision making here, part of that context. But that decision to cancel funding for the pool, to go back on that, when I tell you that this enraged the entire Delray Beach community, people were very, very angry. And they argued that the commission had gone back on its word. And Bank President Colonel Dougal Campbell was incredibly outspoken. So at a commission meeting, he told them exactly how he felt. He said, quote, "You can call me what you want, and I will perhaps lose dollars for speaking up, but I am a human being, and I love other human beings. You have gone back on your honor." And there were even talks about a recall move against the 4 commissioners who had voted for exclusion. And the tensions had reached a boiling point at this point, towards the end of June 1956. And Delray Beach continued to make national headlines. So Jet magazine covered the exclusion ordinance, right, which is this headline here. And other papers reported an unusual amount of guns and ammunition being purchased in the area. And then there was a particularly disturbing report in the New York Times coming out of Seacrest High School. The report in the New York Times told of an effigy of a black child smeared with red paint, which hung from a flagpole at Seacrest High School. A placard on the figure read, quote, "This was the first black one, who is next, by the ANA." That organization, if it was an organization, was not identified. It has not been identified. And school authorities were unable to figure out who did it and why it was right, and just who did it. They were never able to really punish anybody for it. So this is kind of that, right? We've reached this kind of peak at this point at the end of June. But by July, local television stations also began to take notice of what was happening in Delray. Let's see if this will play through. It's going to be a little bit difficult. Well, there we go, real quick. Ralph Rennick, news director of Miami-based television station WTVJ, thank you, Ralph, right? Was called to moderate a discussion between the Delray Beach Civic League and the commission. And both groups wanted the meeting recorded so no misunderstanding could arise, right? So they had television screens. It was a very, there were lights. It was a big, big production. And C. Spencer Pompey was the first one to speak at the meeting, stating, "I do not come to this meeting with the idea of trying to pressurize or force, but we want to appeal to your sense of fair play and justice, and meeting what we consider to be a rather difficult problem." And Pompey, of course, was no stranger to activism. He was best known as an educator and as a coach. But in 1941, Pompey formed the Palm Beach County Teachers Association. And in 1942, he was one of 3 plaintiffs named in a class action lawsuit, Stebbins versus Palm Beach County Board of Instruction, or Board of Public Instruction, which challenged pay discrimination for black teachers, where they received, I believe white teachers received a $20 pay raise, and black teachers received nothing, right? So they filed this lawsuit and ultimately won. And what's interesting also about that lawsuit is they were represented by none other than NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall. So a name some people might recognize. So again, so Spencer Pompey kind of really, so he'd come into his own, he'd been kind of the background, he hadn't been a plaintiff in the federal lawsuit, but he's really at the forefront of these meetings and at the forefront of this Civic League as well. Right. And the conversation between the commission and the Civic League lasted 3 hours. And by the end, the city commission conceded its exclusionary plans, and it vowed to finally construct the previously promised pool. And the meeting was ultimately broadcast throughout South Florida on July 2nd, 1956. And I'm sure you've noticed little kind of Wolfson archives at the very top of a lot of these videos. So that does come from the Wolfson archive, or the Wolfson Moving Image Archive at Miami-Dade College. They are a wealth of information, and they have that entire Ralph Rennick report that's included. The audio is a little spotty, so I did not include it tonight, but it's fascinating. And it was the first time I'd actually ever heard Spencer Pompey's voice. And I will admit, I did get a little choked up, right? Oddly, which is just, again, a weird, nerdy historical thing maybe. But. And so while it was not quite the victory that many anticipated, because again, public facilities remained segregated, the efforts of the Delray Beach Civic League, church groups, and young activists did lead to new facilities. And so in November 1956, the pool, now located in the aptly named Pompey Park, was dedicated in a large ceremony that included members of the Civic League, the City Commission, and notable Delray residents like Carver High School principal Anthony Holliday, and of course, Francis J. Bright, one of the first teachers in Delray. And so we have this really joyful moment, right, at this ceremony, and it was a time of celebration. It was a win, right? It's not integration, but there was a precedent for change and a clear means for dialogue and a way forward. And that's really what the summer of 1956 is about. It's about the persistence of individuals, of community, and about accepting the small victories, but never letting the real goal, out of your sight. And the 1960s, right, as we get into the 1960s, it became a decade of transformational change. And so we start to see real, tangible legislative change happening on the national, state, and local levels. So in 1961, Palm Beach County schools finally started integrating with 5 students, and this included Teresa Jakes and John Green at Lake Worth High School, Iris Hunter Porter at Jupiter High School, Mary Warren at Palm Beach State Junior College, and of course, Yvonne Lee Odom at Seacrest High School. And in April 1962, Delray's Municipal Beach quietly integrated under the leadership of Alfred Zach Strong. And I say quietly because for the most part, looking at kind of historical record, there's not a lot about it. There's almost nothing about it in the city commission, and there's a very small article in local newspapers, so it wasn't widely reported, wasn't widely talked about. So it was quiet, in a historical text concept, context. But Strong, again, he was part of that group that continued to pressure civic leadership until they gained the right to a public beach. And Strong was not only instrumental in integrating the beach, but Delray businesses as well, including restaurants and the laundromat, and just a variety of really necessary businesses. And he was involved very heavily in Delray's community. And so I want to bring our story full circle tonight, and kind of end on somewhat of a high note, but really look at how we learned from our past in real time. So in 1960, the city formed the Interracial Committee, which is a diverse group of educators, business leaders, and activists, and ordinary citizens who work together and advise the commission on how to move forward, and in the best interests of everyone. And the Interracial Committee had 10 members: R.J. Holland, Charles Rooney, Catherine Strong, John Van Sweden, Margaret Walsmith, Leroy Bain, Reverend N.A. Jenkins, C. Spencer Pompey, Lee L. Youngblood, and O.Z. Youngblood. And so this was the start of something. The Interracial Committee did not last for a very long time, but again, this was sort of a way forward, right? This is a way that, they knew that they had, the community knew that this had worked before, right? Coming to the table and coming together and having these kind of community-wide conversations and then bringing those conversations to the commission. But in 1963, it was replaced by the more broadly named Community Relations Committee. And the Community Relations Committee members included Tom Kincaid, again, Catherine Strong, John Van Sweden, Virginia Myers, Dr. Stiles B. Lines, Florence Barnes, Leroy Bain, Lula Baldwin, Rosetta Roll, and C. Spencer Pompey as chair, as if this man did not have enough to do. And the committee advised the commission on a variety of issues, including the inclusion of Black residents on more advisory boards and sort of, a wide array of advisory boards, creating better job opportunities at the municipal level, and a long-range technical training program at the high school level. And again, their language here is very reminiscent of what it was in 1956. And there's this, again, very deliberate, very strategic language, and it's focused on justice, fairness, education, and equal opportunity. But the committee's, I think, most notable recommendation was the repeal of Ordinance 209 or Ordinance 17-34. I told you we would come back to this, right? So I hope everybody memorized that resolution and that ordinance. You'll be quizzed on it. No, just kidding. All right. But during a special meeting in September 1963, Pompey stated, one of the most pressing problems And one of the guarantees that all citizens like to enjoy is equality before and equal protection of the law. And we feel that there is an ordinance on the books which does not provide for this, does not provide this particular thing to either citizens, and would like to see the council take some action regarding this particular ordinance. And Commissioner Alcee Avery very quickly moved to that section 17-34 of the City of Delray Beach Code of Ordinances be eliminated. And although there was some debate amongst the commissioners, a little back and forth, Commissioner Olive Woodard let his second stand. And so he was the first to second, again, very immediately, and he let it stand because he felt the council needs to convey a spirit of fair play and not of an arbitrary ordinance, which is on the books. And so in October 1963, the motion to repeal was carried unanimously, and it was officially repealed on November 12th, 1963. Now, there's been some recent discourse about this ordinance and this resolution, or about Resolution 146, and namely that the ordinance, right, 209-17-34 was repealed, and the earlier resolution was not. And so there was discussions about needing to repeal 146 or keeping it on the books so we don't erase history. And in all this, from a historical perspective, what I was finding, because we were, as the Historical Society was sort of involved in figuring out and kind of combing through a lot of this, because we had just done a lot of this research for the exhibit. But what I found is there was a lot of context that kept getting lost. And not so much the context around the original ordinance or the original resolution, but the context around this ordinance, right, the one that repealed 17-34. And what were lost kind of routinely were the people and the decisions and choices of the people who were responsible for making it happen. Because the important thing I think to remember here in this moment is that, you know, this was a diverse coalition of individuals. Again, all the names that we kind of rattled off here, right? These are a group of individuals who never did things halfway, right? So if Resolution 146 needed to be repealed, I don't know, again, from a historical perspective and reading a lot of his writings, I don't know if anyone has ever seen his book or read his book, More Rivers to Cross. It's about this thick. I read that thing cover to cover, right? Trying to get into his head. But again, if it needed to be repealed, do we think that there's a world where Spencer Pompey would have left it on the books? And I don't think it is, right? I don't think there's a world where that would have happened. And it's not just Pompey, right? At the presentation to repeal the ordinance, Dr. Stiles Lines, who's a committee member and the rector of St. Paul's Episcopal Church, said, quote, "In a broad sense, every citizen of Delray Beach is a member of this committee because of the actions and attitudes of each citizen have much to do with our community relations. Every one of you in this place and in the city of Delray Beach has something that he can and should do to make our community a better one. Every one of you has a responsibility to uphold the Constitution with its Bill of Rights and to cherish and work for the fulfillment of our American belief in the dignity and worth of every human being." Right? That is not somebody who's leaving a discriminatory resolution on the books, right? And I'm officially out my soapbox. I have a microphone, I have to use it, right? And now we could be here all night. I'd be fine with that, no. We could be here all night talking about the continued work and the fight for civil rights and equal rights in Delray Beach, even in just the 1960s, right? We could talk about Reverend Semi Taylor, pictured here, and the Christian Movement for Civic Action, about O.Z. Youngblood being elected as the first Black commissioner in 1968, and about the creation of Atlantic High School in 1970. And we could talk endlessly about the challenges and victories that we've faced as a city and as a community. And we've talked a lot tonight, or I've talked a lot tonight, about the choices our predecessors have made, both for the good of all and for the good of few. And the real question is, and the question I kept coming back to, you know, when working on this presentation is, what do we do with this information? What do we do now that we know this history, right? In addition to sharing it, right? How do we use this? How do we move forward? Because the choices that we make now as individuals and as a community will be looked at someday, especially when some judgmental archivist wants to know more about how we acted in times that challenged us, challenged our rights, challenged our vision of a just world. Much like they did during the civil rights movement, right? They faced a challenging time. And while they were acting in the moment and for the moment, in many ways, I think they were acting for the future and for us today. And so I want to leave us with a quote from historian and political scientist, playwright, and philosopher Howard Zinn, because I think he sums it up and puts it a lot more eloquently than I ever could. So in his autobiography, Zinn wrote, "To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It's based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but of compassion, sacrifice, courage, kindness. And if we remember those times and places, and there are many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents. And to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is in itself a marvelous victory." Thank you.